Anu nitgaber was how "we shall overcome" was translated into Hebrew. And on March the 25th in 1968, which coincided with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's 60th birthday, he and Martin Luther King Jr. attended the Rabbinical Assembly Convention in the Catskills in the Concord Hotel. And they walked into the main convention room together, arm in arm, and as they walked in, 1,000 conservative rabbis stood up, got to their feet, and started singing, Anu nitgaber, Anu nitgaber, Anu nitgaber, Yavo Hayom. I find that story so incredibly powerful. The thought that in that year, 1968, when, as we heard, there were so many people in the Christian world and the Jewish world who were being critical of the work of Reverend King, of Dr. King, that there was that he was actually invited to the RA convention, the convention that I have been to several times, the organization that represents conservative rabbis, and the fact that he was invited to speak and given that platform. And a lot of that was to do with his relationship with Abraham Joshua Heschel. They had an extraordinary close relationship. The words that they shared about each other, both using language, prophetic language, to describe each other. Abraham Joshua Heschel said, as I already said of King, that he was one of the greatest prophetic spirits of the 20th century. And King said of Heschel that he was equivalent to the prophets of Israel, he said of him. And we know, most of us, I think, the story that the story about how, because it was a Friday when a telegram arrived to Heschel from King saying, "Please come and march with us in Selma. We need your presence." And the way his daughter Susanna Heschel describes the activity of that Shabbat, that Erev Shabbat, the whole family getting everything ready. This was obviously pre-internet, pre-mobile phones. They're trying to organize flights so that he can go right after Shabbat and hop on a plane and go down to Alabama. And he was like packing and doing all of this. And Susanna Heschel tells that story, that the second that Shabbat went out, her father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, left for the airport, and they weren't sure they'd ever see him again. Because all they were getting was the images of the brutality of what was happening in those demonstrations. They were getting the brutality of the things that Bull O'Connor was unleashing against protesters, the fire hoses and the dogs. And they'd already had reports of Jewish activists who'd been killed in the civil rights movement. And so there they were, saying goodbye to their father, to Susanna Heschel, saying goodbye to her father. That Motzei Shabbat, as soon as Shabbat went out, and he went down to Selma and joined his brother in arms, his colleague. And they did talk about each other as brothers in arms. Martin Luther King Jr. And what the speech that we so often hear quoted, I think, slightly out of context, is when Heschel said about that day, this is the full quote. He says, "For many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling. And yet our legs uttered songs. And yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying." Very famous quote that many of us know. What I only discovered this week, and nobody knows whether Heschel was aware of the reference or not, was the original statement came from Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, who was the 19th century abolitionist and activist and politician and author. I'm just recently getting to learn a bit about Frederick Douglass and the amazing impact that he had. But he said, back in the 19th century, "I prayed for 20 years, but received no answer, until I prayed with my legs. Such a powerful statement, isn't it? And here we are on Shabbat Shirah, and here we are Erev Tu B'Shvat, and here we are on the eve of MLK's birthday. I received no answer until I prayed with my legs. The relationship between activism and spiritual practice or spirituality or religious worship is a really, really important one. When I had the honor in 2012 to spend a few hours with Dr. Susanna Heschel, Heschel's son, and record an interview with her for a film that I was making, one of the things, even though we were supposed to be talking about the Baal Shem Tov, she spoke so adoringly about her father. And one of the things she said about him was that beside his bed every single night was always a Hasidic sefer, a book of Hasidic Torah and teaching and wisdom, and a copy of the New York Times. And they were equally important to him, she said, because he had to know what was going on in the world, and he had to be an activist, but he was so deeply steeped in Hasidic spiritual thought. And for him, the two were inseparable. They were part of who he was. And much of his activism was inspired by what he saw MLK doing. And their relationship grew. They were an inspiration to each other, the way history tells it. But I think initially, Heschel was inspired to activism. I mean, having had most of his family lost in the Holocaust, he was really inspired by the courageous work of Martin Luther King Jr. I felt my legs were praying. I received no answer until I prayed with my legs. There's a powerful story in the Parsha just before where we started our reading today. And I alluded to it earlier, where here they are, the people are escaping from freedom. They're on this long march towards freedom, and there's a sea in front of them and an army ready to kill them behind them. And what does Moshe do? He starts davening, it seems. And God says, why are you crying out to me? Get moving, get this people moving, keep marching, keep moving forward. And it's such a stirring, it's like, what? But surely, like, that's who Moshe was. He was going to cry out to God. And Rabbi Heschel describes that section of Torah in such a powerful way, I think. He says, God let Moses have it. God said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. Moses has just called upon the people to have faith in God, to rest assured that God will fulfill God's promises. And God responds with irritation and impatience. What is wrong with what Moses had said? If we can understand the dynamics at play between God, Moses, and the Israelites in this moment, we will have gone a long way toward comprehending the way Jewish theology understands the nature of faith and human responsibility. The relationship between faith and human responsibility. You know, some people in the Jewish world think we just pray as hard as we can and eventually we will be redeemed. Eventually Mashiach will come and save us all. And that's antithetical to the Judaism that most of us have. Like sometimes it's about marching forward. People can't just stand there praying and hoping for a miracle. The miracle happens, according to the Midrash, after there is movement, after the people start marching, after Nachshon Aminadab has the courage to, you know, and I hadn't really appreciated that part of the Midrash. The Midrash, the way it describes it, all of the tribes are going, well, I think we should go first, you know, we're the oldest tribe. All the chatter that we sometimes get lost in, I get lost in, all of that chatter, and sometimes you just got to march forward and take those first steps. And that's what Nachshon Aminadab had done and did. Is that praying with legs? I mean, in that particular narrative, it's a journey towards freedom, where the alternative is death. But is it also praying with the legs? How does it relate to the relationship that we might have with activism and passivity? I mean, what the story is really telling us is that God was saying to Moses, this isn't a time for passivity. This is a time for action. And there are times where we, I think, get lost. And when I read that letter that I read extracts to, which I find so incredibly powerful, that letter from Birmingham jail, and the charge to moderate white leaders, I feel I am that moderate white leader. I don't do enough. I care, But ultimately, I don't do enough. There's always so much more that we could be doing in this world. And if MLK weekend means anything, it's about us kind of re-upping the ante for what's important in this world and what we're going to march for and what we're going to pray with our legs for. And not that we don't have spiritual practice, not that we don't have a life of prayer, not that we don't have a relationship to Shabbat and the holidays and the other mitzvot. Of course, that's a really important and integral part of what Jewish life is. But Judaism also demands us to march, to be activists, to go forward, to use our voices when we can. And it's also about singing. And I think the two are also related. When you see how deep a place song has played in the protest movement, it's really inspiring. When you see the role of song as a tool of empowerment, literally of empowerment, you know, of course, the ways in which even during African American slavery, the way so much of the journey towards freedom was taken from the Exodus narratives that we're reading right now. You know, go down Moses, go down to Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. The way all of these Negro spirituals became so embedded in the psyche, in the consciousness of the liberation movements, and still are. Joey Weissenberg, who wrote such a powerful little book called The Torah of Music, The Torah of Music. He talks about, this particular song that we sing on Shabbat Shirah is a song that really happens in the aftermath of a miracle, right? The people have survived and they burst into a song. I mean, I don't know what actually happened. Do they already know the words? Had they been taught the words while they were still slaves? Was it a spontaneous song? It doesn't seem like it. It's pretty complicated biblical poetry. But however it came to be, there is this idea that transformation can follow a miracle if we sing. Not everyone who wants to sing a song can sing a song, but anyone who has experienced a miracle and subsequently sings a song, all their sins will be forgiven and they become a new creature, says the Midrash, Yalkut Shimoni. But the way Joey Weissenberg reads that is, if we don't sing after each miracle that we experience, we may miss tremendous opportunities for personal and global transformation. Since each day and each moment is a miracle, perhaps there are always reasons to sing, even without awaiting a special miracle. The power of marching, the power of standing up, the power of moving forward, the power of praying with our legs, the power of singing. All of these seem to be such rich and important themes in this Shabbat, the Shabbat of Beshallach, the Shabbat of song, but also the Shabbat where we remember the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and really Abraham Joshua Heschel. I mean, the relationship that these men had is, I don't know the exact date this year for Heschel's yahrzeit, but they're always close. Heschel's yahrzeit and Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday are always really close, so they're very often remembered together in this way. So, on Wednesday night, some of us were at a movie at the Dairy Centre and a program that followed that was put on by the JCC, where Stacey Aviva Flint was the moderator of a panel with Annette James, who's the president of our local branch of NAACP, and Reverend Glenda, who's a black pastor at the Second Baptist Church here in town. And Stacey was moderating a panel after a showing of a film called Shared Legacies, which really talked about the relationship between the Jewish and African American world in the civil rights movement. It's a very, very powerful movie. I hope we'll all get to see it at some point. And there were times where there was such deep and important and close connections, and there are times when those connections were fractured. And in some parts of the world, those connections are not so great right now. But when you see some of these activists who were marching there with King, who were a big part of the civil rights movement, some of these African American activists who are talking about their relationships with rabbis and talking about their relationships with other Jewish people, it's really, really remarkable and very moving. But it's not enough. And one thing that really was kind of really touched me in a very deep way was one of the people in the film. It was Harry Belafonte, the singer and entertainer, who talked about his incredible love of the Jewish people and Jewish culture, and he got so involved with Jewish people and Jewish culture because of his activism, and that so many of the activists that he was working alongside were Jewish. And there's a little clip of him singing Hava Nagila with Danny Kaye, which some of you might have seen that. But he's talking now as an old man in the film, and he talks in a very, very sweet and delightful way about his relationship with Jewish people. But then he says this line. He said, "But I was always suspicious of the Jews who didn't speak up." It was just like, whoa, what do we do with that? And then just recognizing the frailty of being a leader. We think of that story Rabbi referred to, where Moshe can't hold up his arms, and he has these two, Aaron and Hur, helping to hold up his arms. But sometimes the frailty of leadership is the fear of what it would mean to speak up. I feel so moved by that, reading that letter from Birmingham jail. I feel so moved by it because these people who want, everything to be nice and everything to be okay and not to rock the boat too much. I'm very aware that I'm in that world so much of the time. That in this last few years, there are times that I've really spoken up, and there's times that I really haven't spoken up. And it's like, as King says, much more afraid of the silence of our friends than the words of our enemies, right? And that passage where he talks about being more comfortable somehow with the absolute hatred of the enemy rather than the quiet of the friends. And I feel like I want to use this weekend to really think more deeply about when it's okay to remain silent, and when it's really not okay to remain silent, when it's okay to speak up, and when we have to sing, and when we have to stop singing, and when we have to dance, and when we have to stop dancing, and when we have to march, and when we have to speak, and all of it. It's so complicated. We live in a very, very complicated world. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering, there's still so much injustice. The euphoria around the Washington March, when you see clips of that in the film, and you see the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were there and carried away by that message and by that prophecy and by that hope and by the possibility of what was going to happen. And some of it happened, but some of it didn't happen. And some of it is still not happening. And there's a lot of work to do. All right, I'm rambling. I'm sorry. Just let's honor the legacies of these great men, these prophets of the 20th century, and everything that they stood for, and do what we can to continue the work of justice, whether it's climate justice, whether it's racial justice, economic justice. There's a lot of work to do. And if we sing, it makes the work easier. Anu nitkabe, anu nitkabe, anu nitkabe, yavo ayom. Deep in my heart, I do declare, we shall overcome someday. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, Maybe before we finish up our service, just anyone going to commit to doing something in honor of MLK's legacy, something towards justice? Oh, by the way, I meant to mention that the NAACP has put together this incredible exhibit in the Dairy Centre of photos from the civil rights movement that just opened this week, and we've got a glimpse of it. And Stacey Aviva Flint is a docent of the exhibition, and we're going to put out the times that she's going to be there so that people can go and really have a tour of the exhibit with her, because there are some incredibly powerful images in there. Anyone?
Go to that.
Huh? Go to that? Okay, it's just the first step. Anyone else going to take an action in honor of
educating our children? I was deeply moved by reading a story of my kindergartners on Friday at their
by reading what?
I read a story on MLK to my kindergartners on Friday, and they were appalled. And I was like, good, I framed it the right way. You should be appalled at some of the things that happened in history.
I mean, I just have to say on that note that this was so moved me. I hadn't read this before, but as they were, Heschel, everyone was so shocked, obviously, after King was, and Heschel was the only rabbi who gave a eulogy, as I said, at the funeral. And then as they left the funeral, it was in Ebenezer Baptist Church. These three men, Mickey Shaw, who became Rabbi Moshe Shaw, and Peter Geffen, who's I know his son Jonah, he founded the New York Heschel School. They were walking from the church back to the hotel where Heschel was staying. And Geffen and Shaw asked Heschel, what do we do now? And Heschel's response, you must teach the children so that they can remake the world. And then he died a few years later of a really sudden heart attack. You must teach the children so that they may remake the world. So we're doing that work.
I'm going to go to the exhibition, and I'm going to read Dr. King's letter. And I'd like to start reading Dr. King more seriously and actually read his thought and read other people's thought too, and woefully uneducated.
That letter's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Oh,
wait, no, that's easy. Thanks.
Yeah.
Very, very small type.
Right, guys, it's late. It's 10 past 12.
I have a question for you, Rabbi.
Yes.
What can we do to help you as a leader to push that edge that you're talking about, where you don't want to be a white moderate and you want to stand up and speak when it's right to speak and march when it's right to march? What do you need from us, the congregation?
Good question.
I'll think about it.
First thought, good thought. You've got to tell us though, otherwise we can't do it.
Reb Brock and I were both at we're late, but Reb Brock and I were both at a really powerful convening of interfaith clergy, and we heard a pastor called James Ray, who asked this incredibly provocative question. Michael Ray Matthews, sorry. Michael Ray Matthews, who said, Are you chaplains of the empire or prophets of the resistance?
Oh my God. Oh my God.
So it's hard, because being a clergy person, you have to be both to some extent. But it's about knowing when to be a prophet of resistance and when to be a chaplain of the empire. I'm going to be radical and say, enough words of prayer. We're late. We're not going to do a full musaf. We'll sing Ein Keloheinu. This is what we always used to do when we were live streaming. We'll do Ein Keloheinu. We'll make sure there's a mourner's kaddish for those of you who are saying kaddish, and we'll finish up today, because that's what we're going to do. There you are. That was radical.
Oh my God! I'm walking with my tongue with my teeth.
So page 204.